Fantastic. Welcome, everybody. Let me start sharing my screen to begin with. So this is the symposium on the second day of what has proven to be a fantastic conference already. Certainly been very stimulating, and I think today is going to be no exception. So in this symposium, we're going to be listening to three fantastic scholars who I personally have worked with over the last few years, and I'm incredibly honoured to be here and to be the discussant. But before we kick off, I think it's appropriate that we acknowledge country. As we gather for this meeting physically, dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We, and I, acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, of all the land that we work and live on, and ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. I think that's particularly relevant for today, where we're thinking about traditions in education and the future of how we're going to engage in a post-digital world. So, as I was saying, I've had the pleasure of working with these three scholars. I'm not going to read out their bios because I'm sure you've all sort of read the bios already when you signed up. Each of them are going to take a different journey, a very, very different journey into the exploration of post-digital assessment. First, we're going to hear from Rola, who talks about assessment as portrayal and the strategic negotiation of persona. And then Margaret, who's going to talk about assessment for an AI-mediated world. And then Phil is going to challenge us with notions around surveillance and the weaponization of academic integrity. Each of these people have, in my own experience, pushed my thinking, and I'm a better scholar for it. But it's not been comfortable. And today, I think it's going to be the same. It's going to be an uncomfortable, but at the same time, pleasurable journey into some real dilemmas that we're faced with. So first of all, I'd like to ask Rola to perhaps begin with her paper.
Thank you, Michael. I'll just share my screen. All right. Good morning, everyone. I've got the pleasure of talking about the intersection of assessment and digital through two key ideas that I want to share with you. The first is that we need to, in our practices and also research, start thinking about assessment that helps students to actually portray their achievements in richer ways. And the second point is that alongside portrayal of achievement is to help students to portray who they are and who they are becoming through the concept of persona and celebrity studies. So if you're wondering what Kim Kardashian has to do with assessment, you're in the right talk. So here we go. A lot of what I'm talking about today is in our book, Chapter 6, and I'd like to acknowledge my two co-authors, David Marshall, who's a professor of celebrity studies here at Deakin, and David Bowd, who needs no introduction. So if at any time you lose where I'm at, or if you'd like to find out more, it's all in this chapter, and we'll be launching this book actually tonight as well. So I don't need to tell you that the digital is changing a lot of what we do, and in particular the nature of work. In the nature of the post-digital, it means that it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, and it has fundamentally changed our relationship with the digital. And we see that in the blurring of the professional and private lives. We get emails at all sorts of hours of the day. We portray who we are on various platforms digitally, and we take a lot of care in strategically negotiating that persona that we present on these different platforms, whether it's Twitter, whether it's etc. We also have a shift in the way careers are becoming more fluid and precarious in a sense. And we talk now of students changing their careers multiple times. And so we need to start to equip, or we don't need to start, we've been doing it. We equip our students to be able to develop and articulate their career identities for a long, successful career. And a lot of this has to do with the way they portray and the ways we portray our digital identities. And so you'll see this through the employability agenda. Graduates must be able to adapt and repackage their skills and experiences to fit the changing workforce. And this isn't just about an instrumental view of the worker, but about a more fundamental stance in the world about helping students to present who they are and who they are becoming in richer and more complete, authentic ways. So does our assessment do that at the moment? Well, assessment should technically serve multiple purposes, and it does in terms of certification. Has the student completed the degree? It helps to guide learning. It helps develop the skills that students need to narrate their career identities, to be able to think metacognitively about what they're doing in order to develop the attributes necessary for lifelong learning. Furthermore, assessment needs to develop their evaluative judgments. However, the ways in which our assessment portrays these achievements and many more is rather impoverished. What our graduates receive on graduation is often a testament signed by someone, the VC, and a transcript. And at best, what the transcript communicates with potential employers or anyone else out there in the world is that this student has A, completed the degree, and B, done relatively well or merely passed a set number of units, which doesn't really contextualize what the student can actually do and who the student is. And it's this that we take, I don't know if offense is the right word, but this is the thing we problematize in the chapter and also in a paper that's hopefully forthcoming with Dave and I. In that the ways we represent assessment at the moment is rather impoverished, and it's not helping necessarily our students to communicate who they are, and certainly not in digital ways. And there's ways that we can do this perhaps more effectively. And so Dave and I have proposed this notion of assessment as portrayal. And we did this in a chapter, not in this current book, but a different book. And we argued that assessment needs to enable students to portray their achievements and themselves in public ways that communicate directly with others, including future employers, and that is controlled by the student. And you might be thinking, well, there's already ways in which we do this in assessment, and that's true. There are trends towards this, and we see this in a couple of ways predominantly. One of which is that the increase in hallmarks, for example, which is what Deakin does, where students can show their distinctiveness. So how do they stand out in a sea of graduates? Well, they do that by perhaps gaining particular qualifications or micro-credentials, within the degree that encapsulate contextually what it is that they could do. And this can be housed digitally or within a portfolio system that students can then take with them into the world, where they can curate, articulate their learning achievements and who they are becoming, and it's something that can connect with their vertical learning. And the digital, which is where I started with all of this, not only affords opportunities to do that, but it almost necessitates that students need to learn to navigate and safely and effectively the different communities online and the different platforms through their future journeys in their careers. And assessment needs to be able to do that. And so these are the two key points that I'm talking about. The first, which is this bit that I mentioned already, is that our assessment representation needs to help students portray their achievements in richer ways. The second part is helping them portray who they are and who they are becoming. And to do that, we drew on persona studies. And this comes from the world of celebrity, where celebrities and the ways that they strategically negotiate their persona online is kind of a way that we can start to think about what these students might be able to do, but perhaps in more scaffolded and safe ways. A persona is a fabricated reconstruction of the individual that is used to play a role that both helps the individual navigates their presence and interactions with others and helps the collective to position the role of the individual in the social. And I love this from David Marshall and colleagues, because this isn't merely about the individual on their own fabricating a story, but it's in relation to a community of practice that they are seeking to join or are already within. And so there's something in that about learning the ways of being, of talking, walking the walk, talking the talk, that we can support our students in becoming. And the notion of reconstruction is important here, because the question of personas being snapshots in time that are constantly evolving and changing, there is still a sense of authenticity in there. And I draw here on the work that was presented yesterday by Adam Brown and Emily Wade, who talked about authenticity not as a one truth that's out there, but as the effect that is brought upon the people who are the audience, in other words. I won't go through all these 5 dimensions, but in the chapter we talk about the ways we might think about how persona are in the world, who they're communicating with, what collective they're trying to bring the student into, how do they brand themselves within that, and there's an intentionality in that practice, and these dimensions might potentially help us to design different forms of digital assessment. So what does this help us to do? So reimagining assessment using persona studies. It introduces an explicitly subjective dimension that assessment practices have attempted to obscure. What I mean by this is that, who validates a persona? It's no longer the domain necessarily of the academic. It's out there, it's in the community, in the ways that people then engage with this student, and then the ways that they actually make connections and fit. It prompts a rethink of how we might judge the quality of portrayal for future work, and encourages student agency in the construction of who they are and who they are becoming, as well as what is required of them in defining their stance for a particular community. And I really like this work here from Gloria Del Alba, who's speaking later today, that says that authenticity isn't about mirroring the context. It's about helping our students to make a stance in the world about who they are and who they are becoming. So finishing off here, one of the questions that Dave and I are playing with at the moment is the notion of how representation of assessment versus portrayal, and what we're asking here, that the idea that we're representing student achievement indicates that there's a truth that's out there that is merely transparently being communicated. And I think that's the objectivity that we've always seen in this notion of marks and grades. Versus portrayal, which is an active, situated enactment, and I think that's why we're going with portrayal, but we need to theoretically play with that a bit more. In terms of design and research, who are the networks? How are the situated constructions being judged and by whom? How can we formally validate this form of assessment that might sit alongside other traditional forms of assessment? What aspects of multimedia might be needed and for what purpose, and how can authentic construction be scaffolded meaningfully and safely? Because we're not saying go out there and portray everything. There's a tension there between how much and remaining credible, but being open and vulnerable at the same time. So just to finish off, Persona Studies offers the possibility of reimagining assessment to authentically engage student multiple identities to help portray their achievements as well as who they are, and to do so in a digital world. We argue it's a more reflexive form of assessment, and I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rola. We'll take questions after all three presentations, and please do remember to throw your questions into the Slido environment. So we're going to move now on to Margaret, and feel free to take over. Take it away. And you're on mute, which is the cry of a post or a COVID environment.
Sorry, thank you.
There we go.
I'm struggling with my Zoom a little bit today. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen as well too. All good? Yep, great. I'm talking about assessment for an AI-mediated world, and like Rola, this comes from a chapter that's in this book. So here's again my shameless plug. Please come to the book launch tonight at the conference close. And I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author, Rose Lucken from University College of London on this work. So where I'm coming from a slightly different place. So there's been an argument made by Joseph Owen around the need to robot-proof higher education. And that's simply saying that it's not just enough for our students in a time of technological change to understand technology, but to build skills that technology can't contribute. In other words, a robot-proof education nurtures our unique capacities as human beings. And with respect to AI, I think it's worth taking a step back and asking, what does AI do well? And there are many different sorts of AI. I'm here in this reflection, I'm really talking about more machine learning. But I think that's the one that's causing us the most challenge in our current working environments. So AI does well. It identifies patterns in text, image, and space. It does it incredibly accurately, for the most part, far better than humans. It's exponentially faster than humans and at scale. Now, this doesn't sound like an incredibly challenging type of capabilities, but it actually is. It's immense. And I'll give you the example here of automated essay grading. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but automated essay grading is really occurring right now on a large scale. Pearson do it, and I think my understanding is they've actually contributed a lot of this research as well too. So software can very well grade essays, and it grades them very accurately when compared with human markers, but it does it much quicker. And things like 1.3 million student essays provide students with an automated grade, and they look at their grade and it correlates with improved essay grades. So there's a lot of work being done on this incredible capacity. I mean, think of the labour being saved with 1.3 million student essays being graded. However, there are restrictions. Essays are restricted to particular topics and tasks. Not everything's good for automated grading. They're bounded by the quality of the original data set. So how these AI works is they take in a large body of data and then look for patterns within the data, and they train on those patterns. But if the original data has, problematic patterns, as we see with, the infamous chatbot Tay, you can get all sorts of distortions happening in the quality. And there are no dialogic explanations. So in this instance, formative feedback is seen to be a score. There's no back and forth with someone saying, well, why did I get that grade, or even what is it about the quality of my work? So there are limitations. And I guess for me, the little mantra that runs through my mind is if a machine can grade a task, a machine can do the task. So if we have tasks that machines can grade, they may not be the ones that we want our students to be doing. So what should tasks look like? What should assessment look like that builds uniquely human capabilities? And there are two things that I'm particularly interested in. Now, Owen talks about things like creativity and I think teamwork, and there's all these other sorts of uniquely human capabilities that are proposed. But for me, they're often a little intangible. And they're two that I like that I think cut across almost all forms of assessment and that draw on things that I think not only are uniquely human, but are necessary to work with AI as well too. And these two capabilities are the ability to determine what constitutes quality, success, to develop a standard. And you'll have heard about that talked a lot today in terms of evaluative, well, in terms of this conference, in terms of evaluative judgment. There was a couple of research papers yesterday on evaluative judgment. And alongside that, I think our assessments need to build some sense of meta-intelligence, knowing about how you know, and this is often referred to as personal epistemology. And these are, I think, together really valuable capabilities that assessment can easily promote. So evaluative judgment, and as again, I think you will have heard this term a lot, and I'll represent the definition of Tai et al., capability to identify quality of work of both self and others. And for me, I think it's more than just identify. I think it's also about constructing a sense of what quality is. And certainly I've been doing some work with Rola, Liz Malloy, other colleagues about what quality means within healthcare practice for training doctors. And if you ask an advanced intensivist, intensive care trainee about how they know their work is good, it's quite an interesting thing. It is very tacit. It's very unique to their particular circumstance, to their particular patient. But at the same time, they need to be able to have a sense of whether what they're doing is the right thing in a very, very diffuse world. So back in university land, in the academy, I think we can really help promote those senses already through cycles of self, peer and educator assessment. And my favourite paper on this is now an oldie but a goodie, which is Bowden Malloy on feedback by design. I think those cycles of self, peer and educator assessment are so good at promoting what this sense of quality is. And I think this is something that we can really do to help with this incredibly important capability of evaluative judgment. And alongside this, I also think that we need to look at assessment that develops personal epistemology. And I think that this is really deliberately calling attention to the evaluative judgment process. And we can do this in a number of ways. Something that Rola and I have been exploring is about the role of rubrics and other assessment criteria. I'm really interested in the materials of assessment, the designs, the tasks, the things that we give students to do. And I think that rubrics and the other pieces as well form really powerful, what I'll call epistemic artifacts. That is to say, they create knowledge as well as represent it. And by this I mean is when you get a rubric, I don't know if you've done an assessment recently or you've had to do something, had a rubric and you had to score yourself against it. And when you're creating something that has to meet some criteria, you do go to the criteria and say, well, what's really required in this circumstance? And in this way, the rubric really helps you create knowledge. It's not just something that's static, it's sitting there. You bring it into your world and you play it out. And if you think about it, for example, if you have someone very experienced doing an assessment task that is, say, an expert practitioner doing a first year assessment task, and they're looking at the rubric, they're actually not going to do what they do in practice. They're going to go to the rubric and look at what that might look like again. So they're really powerful. They direct what's being created, or what's being the work that is done. And I think that in our assessments, we can draw attention to this a little bit more. For example, the role of the rubric. In what ways did you rely upon the rubric to influence your thinking? What other possibilities might have fulfilled the brief? What criteria were most difficult to fulfill and why? You might also ask, what criteria did you disagree with? You might say, what did you think was good and bad about exemplars? What exemplars did you use? It's really about saying, how do these artifacts help me come to understand knowledge? And through that, start to understand about the process of creating your own view about what knowledge is. So I guess to be a little bit more practical, I think that assessment tasks ideally prompt students to answer these sorts of questions. What sort of qualities make this a good piece of work? If I were to set the criteria of success, what would they look like? And how do I know if I've done a good job? Because these are questions that machines can't answer. They can identify the qualities that make a good piece of work based on another data set, but they can't constitute the qualities other than based on things that other people have done. And they certainly can't set criteria for success, and they certainly can't know if they've done a good job. They can only meet certain preset requirements. As yet, of course, there is always the allure of a different sort of artificial intelligence. So I guess in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that I think assessment for an AI-mediated world should really focus on these things. As I said, there are other capabilities that are uniquely human, but I think these cut across almost all assessment tasks and are linked to all, therefore linked to all courses and all outputs. And I think the other really big advantage of these these capabilities is they're not only complementary to working with AI, but they help learners understand any contribution of AI to future work. Because the other thing about, well, certainly machine learning AI is it's very black boxed. You don't know what's happening underneath the surface. So what you can go on is understanding what the outputs are, what quality looks like. And to think about how you know what you know. Is it just because you have some input? To start to think really deeply about what a machine can contribute and what a human can contribute. And that's all that I have to say. So I will stop sharing now and hand over to Phil.
Thank you very much. And yes, Phil, please take it away.
All right. Okay. So some of you will be seeing me superimposed on slides, some with a bit of slide in the background. It's all cool, whatever you got. So I'm going to talk about something I think it's pretty contentious at the moment, which is this idea of surveillance and the weaponization of academic integrity. I'm also plugging part of a book. You might be able to see this. It fades into the background. This is my new book, Defending Assessment Security in a Digital World. My copy came to me just on Friday. So the Deakin Library has it. I think some libraries have it. Physical copies might take a little while. You might love or hate it by the end of this talk, though. There's three key things that I want to get across. Firstly, that I think higher education assessment security has a surveillance culture. I don't know whether I'll convince you of that, but I think the evidence is there. And secondly, that this might be okay if it works and we're okay with the trade-offs. And that's an if with the two Fs, the if and only if. because I think we do need to be okay with certain trade-offs to be okay with the surveillance culture. And thirdly, that we should fear what I'm going to call the weaponization of surveillance and academic integrity. So, you know, the idea of surveillance is very much in our culture at the moment. Edward Snowden's revelations about mass spying, mass surveillance, all of that really powerfully put into our brains this idea of suspicionless surveillance. So it's not surveillance of people who are known to be doing bad, nasty things. It's just general surveillance of everyone at all times without any real cause to suspect that they're doing the wrong thing. So this is society at large. And this is education. On the left is drones flying over an exam venue in China, monitoring the students inside to see if they're using their phones, all sorts of other cheating methods. And on the right is the webcam that monitors people during their remote proctored exams. Remote proctored, remote invigilated, you know, the ones where you're watched through a webcam while you complete tasks. You're also monitored through your keystrokes and through your microphone and other stuff like that. These sorts of things are, I think, unambiguously surveillance. I don't think that's sort of where the difficulty is. The question then is it a surveillance culture? And that's where I'm going to draw on David Lyon's work. David Lyon sets out a bunch of ideas around a new thing where we move beyond just surveillance to something that's deeply part of the culture. So firstly, surveillance culture relies on surveillance by a range of government and or commercial entities. So not just state security doing the surveillance, but there's surveillance by others who are involved as well. Within the education environment, that might be text matching companies, that might be remote proctored exams companies. You'll notice I'm using very generic terms here. These are litigious entities sometimes, and I don't want to call them out by name, but this is, I'd say, pretty easy to agree with me that it's a range of different groups doing it. The next one is citizens being active participants in surveillance. So surveillance has moved beyond having surveillance done to you being part of the surveillance. And that sort of links in with Lyon's next point, which is that surveillance is sold to us as being for our own good, and it provides us with useful insights about our lives and work. I don't know about you, but you know, when I go on a bike ride, I put on Strava. Strava surveils me while I go on my ride, tells me when I was fast, when I was slow, what my route was. It's really useful for ensuring that I stick within the 5 kilometre or 25 kilometre radius that I've got to do here in Melbourne. It's for my own good. I really appreciate that, but it is unambiguously surveillance that I am an active, enthusiastic participant in. Now, you can see similar things in higher ed around formative checks for grammar or formative checks for text matching, copy-paste plagiarism. Students actively choosing to be surveilled, in addition to the surveillance that is imposed on them without their choice. So that's another component of surveillance culture. And another key point is sort of leaky boundaries around data ownership across corporations, government, and other entities. So you may be surveilled ostensibly by a university, but really the apparatus is owned by some third party in another jurisdiction. And there's a lot of complicated privacy controls around all of that. Now, I would put it to you that higher education does have that surveillance culture, that we don't just do sort of targeted surveillance against people who we think are cheating. We do this sort of mass, suspicionless surveillance in partnership with other entities. And to an extent, students do believe it's for their own good. To an extent, students are really annoyed about it as well. And you'll see that in some of the petitions that have been going around with students really objecting to certain things. Most recently, it's remote proctored exams. But if you go back a number of years, it's things like text matching tools. So there is a mix of opinions on this. So what are the problems with it? Well, in the chapter of the same title as this presentation, I go into it in a lot of depth, but a quick snapshot is there's arguments that it creates a culture of distrust. That, if you go to, say, David Carlis's wonderful work on trust and assessment, different things we do in assessment communicate things about trust. This surveillance communicates distrust. It frames students as in need of monitoring and student work as a space of dishonesty, that's what's going on in student work. Students and their data become the product. There I'm referring to Jesse Stommel, who argued that the recent sale of Turnitin for $1.75 billion US was possibly a sale for the data, the student data that Turnitin has, more than the sale of the Turnitin products. So that becomes the product. That academic integrity becomes a game of submitting to or subverting the surveillance. So rather than trying to do good work with integrity, you instead try to do work that the systems won't be angry at you for. And that it communicates an acceptance of surveillance. What we do in the academy communicates to students that it's an okay thing to do. If we surveil students, we are tacitly saying that surveillance is kind of okay. I'm going to put to you that we need to balance two things to be able to reconcile surveillance. Academic integrity, which is a positive, educative and values-based mission. And there I've got, things like the International Day of Action Against Contract Cheating. A good thing to do, but you could kind of caricature it with a say no to drugs type messaging. I don't know how effective that is in and of itself, but it's really important. And then assessment security, which is a big topic of my book, which is adversarial, punitive, and evidence-based. We want to actually know if things work, if our approaches to stop cheating actually stop cheating. And these two things are in tension, but they're not dichotomous. You can have both. You should strive to do both. We should strive to encourage students and equip them to do good work and to ensure that people aren't able to cheat through the high stakes moments in a degree. Now, surveillance, in this view, does nothing good for academic integrity. Yeah, it might be a useful assessment security approach, but we're kidding ourselves if we think it promotes academic integrity. So it's therefore only useful as far as it has demonstrable or provable assessment security benefits. So we need to be allowed to watch the watchers. If they've got nothing to hide, they should let us watch them. I've had the difficulty of trying to do research studies where I try to cheat in online exams. Last year, I had to give research funding back to a funder because I could not find a vendor of remote proctored exams who was willing to do this sort of research. Where I try to cheat, I get professional cheaters to cheat, and we see if the tools actually stand up, if they actually provide those benefits. My big argument to you here is that this stuff's only of benefit if we can be sure that it's worth the trade-offs. We've talked about the trade-offs, we know those, but does it actually deliver? And there I've got a link to Ian Linkletter's current legal defence fundraiser, because this is a litigious industry and people who question it can find themselves on the receiving end of lawsuits. Look that up if you want more info of that. But this is what can happen if you question that industry. I'm going to close by saying that, well, I fear a lot of this stuff in the future might be weaponized. There's Dr. Martin Luther King. His work is wonderful and a really positive ethical contribution to society. But at the same time, his work contains what we would now call copy-paste plagiarism. With our current values, it's not okay. But within the traditions of the time, it's accepted as an acceptable oversight on his part. His PhD was not revoked. We're still okay with the I have a dream speech, which contains copy-paste plagiarism. But viewed through the values of our time, he did things that aren't okay. I worry that we're going to retroactively apply some of these surveillance and punitive approaches when people do missteps into the future. And I'm going to conclude by saying, please don't run my work through my undergrad student work through any of the current surveillance and monitoring approaches, because I guarantee you there'll be stuff that I just didn't know about. And I think the same is true for all the rest of us. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Sometimes I do feel you might overshare a little bit too much. But thank you. Wow. So everybody, I'm the discussant for this session, and as a discussant, I have the privilege of offering a few thoughts. Now, Rola, Marg, and Phil, I knew and I know I'm not frightened to offer up new big ideas. But seriously, how am I going to bring together personas, AI, and cheating in any kind of sensible order? But of course, they have all offered some interesting insights about what it might mean to be and to assess in a post-digital age. I think each of these presentations have offered us a bold vision. We're challenged to consider what we could or should value in a post-digital age of assessment. We're asked to think about the distinctiveness of being human, of being and becoming, and to question how we know and can trust that assessment. It strikes me that each of these presentations have not just offered or have not offered us easy solutions. In fact, inherent in all of them, there are some dilemmas. And these are the things that worry me. A dilemma by nature is where no matter what choice, and in fact, the choice of not making a choice is in itself a problem. There is no right answer. There is no way to move forward without some sort of negotiation, some sort of giving up of one thing to achieve something else. For example, on one hand, Phil warns us about a culture of distrust where we bring to bear the might of technology, and it is mighty, as Marg has sort of pointed out, to seek out patterns of deviation where being too similar or being too different can be treated with suspicion. On the other hand, we've got Rola calling for a rich rather than impoverished assessment environment to privilege and seek out what it means to be. Our personas may be contextual constructions, but they're intimately and inevitably connected to ourself, to our values, our beliefs, our broader being. So we're faced with a dilemma. Are we ready to engage with our students in such a holistic and trusting way and ask them to give up of themselves in such a way, while also we're part of an industry that really, as Phil has pointed out, is riddled with distrust. In fact, would seek out those connections and behavior that might deviate from what's expected, and by doing so, value and privilege the norm. Are we so sure we can design assessment that privileges the distinctness of being human while colonizing that very humanity with our normative expectations through a culture of assessment and distrust? If we are to ask students to reveal their networks, their values, their performances through and across media, how can we be assured of their consent? It's an ethical dilemma that we face in a space of big data, of tracing and tracking, and of Phil's own admission of not wanting to look back into history. How much can we really trust and feel secure in this space? And yet, what's the consequence of not taking such a bold step? These are some really big questions for us. But we shouldn't shy away. These three presentations, I feel, are calls to arms, to be bold, to act, to think, to step forward rather than just react to a post-digital age. It strikes me that there's a number of questions, including the dilemmas that I started to point out. And really for me, one of the biggest questions, and the one that I've posed to these three presenters, is, are we ready? Are we ready? Do we know what we need to do? It's not the people in this room, but it's everyone else, isn't it? It's the educators, institutions, industry, and indeed society, the leaders, citizens, our families. What are we talking to? Assessment is not just something that we do in universities and then it has no other future implication. Indeed, it has a lot of implication. Are our educators in a heavily sessionalized industry prepared and expert enough to know what it means to be? What is the persona that they need to be assessing? What are the epistemologies that are valued in this industry? Are we ready to step up and make that judgment? Rich assessment as opposed to impoverished assessment could be enabled through rich data trails. But are our institutions and indeed society ready to be convinced that integrity is not the same as security, that success shouldn't necessarily be met with distrust, and the representation of what is uniquely human is perhaps not best met with surveillance? We've got these challenges. Now, rather than me taking up more space, because I have a unique privilege of being able to talk to all of these presenters at any time, I think we should hand over to the questions that have been flowing in. Yuso, you might like to take over.
Oh, yes. There are a couple of very, very interesting questions in the Slido. I've tried to decide those questions that would really offer many perspectives for all of our presenters to engage with them. Maybe first I could ask the question by Madeleine. That was really about the context of higher education. And I think this question was addressed to Rola, but I'm sure that all of the presenters might have something to say about this. So Madeleine asked whether assessment-as-portrayal is run in every discipline. For example, in the highly mathematical disciplines, natural sciences, that might have, let's say, more black and white or right or wrong answers built in these disciplines. So is there room for subjectivity in assessment in every discipline and context of higher education?
Thanks, Yuso and Madeleine. So here's my question back to you, Madeleine. When we graduate students from a mathematics discipline, do we want them to just know how to do maths and to learn about maths? Or do we actually want them to be mathematicians out in the world who can seek out different jobs and use their avenues of skills, attributes, capabilities, their stance in the world across potentially different careers? And I think that's where the ontological comes in. Now, doesn't have to be an either or, and I'm sorry if I put that across. I think you need both. You need you need to help students learn the knowledge, but you also need to help them learn how to use that knowledge in situated ways, and that's very much interlinked with who they are. So I think, yes, we do need to help students in all the disciplines portray what they've actually achieved and who they are, alongside other traditional forms of representation. And I think it has to be authentic to the discipline. So I think it will look different for different disciplines, but ontology, who that person is and what they stand for, is a thing that is relevant for all disciplines, I think.
Can I have a very small answer to that, Yuso? Would that be? Can I jump in? The only reason I'm asking is because I actually had the pain of doing an honours degree, which was essentially in pure maths, and subjectivity for me at that level was very high, and I can certainly see how because you have to make a lot of judgment calls about what things are and what your approach is. And nothing has ever hurt my brain ever as much as that year. And I think that representing some of those challenges and debates in a persona type way would have been really valuable. So I do think that there is a call even in those disciplines that appear to be very cut and dried, that in some levels they're probably not so.
Awesome, thank you very much. The next question is by Trina, and once again, I think this is something that all of you might have something to say about this very important topic of inequity in the field of assessment, especially in the modern times. So Trina asked, AI is only as good as the data that goes into it. How do we leverage the promise of AI without further privileging the ways of communicating and knowing that already create barriers and contribute to inequality?
I would like to own Google and answer that question in a different way. I'd also like to just own Google full stop, because that would be a very different life I would be living. But nonetheless, I think it's a really big question. I think that we can't answer that where we sit. I believe that what we can do is equip people to understand that potential in higher education. So I think that if we go to the view of thinking about our jobs, and even within assessment, as promoting this sort of idea that looking to, and it goes back to what I was, the mantra I was giving before. If we think about our choices about what makes success, what makes quality, we have to bring ethics into it. And it means that we have means and a mode to interrogate outputs and to call them out. Because I don't think we can't prevent AI working from how it works. I think that's too big a question. But I do think we can equip people to be the ones to call it out.
I might just add a little bit in there. A lot of the assessment security, surveillance type products are now AI products. And there have been some recent instances where they haven't dealt well with the diversity of students. There was one in the media recently, which is just one reported case in the media. It's not peer-reviewed stuff, but it was of a Black student in America. She needed to have light shining on herself very brightly throughout her entire remote proctored exam. Otherwise, it wouldn't see a face. Clearly, that's a problem somewhere along the line. Is it they didn't think of people like her studying to be a lawyer? Because it was the bar exam to be a lawyer in the US. Is it the proctoring company didn't have people like her in the data set? We do need to do a lot better as far as the diversity that goes into those sorts of algorithms.
Thank you. The next question is by Thui, and I hope that I pronounce your name correctly, but I probably don't, who connected this idea of surveillance with assessment for learning, and I think this is something very interesting. So maybe we'll start with Phil. What do you think about this connection? So assessment for learning, which would be based on formative assessment, tracking students' performance, trying to promote student performance. Can you see the connection with the idea of surveillance, and what could we do with this issue if it comes up as an issue?
Okay, so firstly, I think that we shouldn't bother with assessment security measures for assessment for learning. So we should identify those moments that are assessment of learning moments that really matter for a degree program level. And we should try to secure those really important moments. And there's not going to be one of those in every single unit of study. In the other moments, we should say, hey, we are trying to do assessment for learning here. Let's try to not surveil students. Let's try to make it a wonderful moment for learning, a moment to improve academic integrity rather than assure assessment security. So I see sort of surveillance and assessment for learning as being kind of at opposite ends. You could, however, look at Val Schute's work around, oh bother, the name of it is failing me, stealth assessment. Which is this idea that, well, perhaps instead of discrete moments of assessment, we might just let students participate in assessment for learning and monitor them and then identify, hey, you've ticked off this learning outcome, and do all that in the background. So I guess there is an alternative, but I'd say separate them out.
So I think, and Phil, I'm not sure about your thoughts on this, is I've had the privilege of seeing some of the different proctoring approaches and the technology developments, and I'm troubled like you about some of the consequences. But at the same time, I think there's some interesting opportunities for the technologies to support assessment for learning, not for the surveillance purpose, but the way in which, for instance, video, audio, and other objects or artifacts that can be captured digitally in response to a situation. So in the most broadest sense, there's an assessment and a student responds, or there is a task and a student responds, and there's different ways to capture that. And I think ways that we're seeing, such as multiple video channels between the invigilator and the student, but if we replace the invigilator with an educator or other proxies, or, you know, there are interesting kinds of things that I think we're starting to see, and then bringing in the AI components of these invigilated environments to be able to flag and adapt and feedback. I think we might actually see some really rich silver linings to a troubled space.
Yeah, I guess I just want to really flag, I'm not anti the remote proctoring. I just think they need to front up with some evidence that it works for it to the trade-offs to be worth it. But definitely what you're saying can be really fantastic. We have a great example at Deakin in construction management, where students do a costing exercise using the authentic tools that someone uses to cost construction projects. And it's proctored and recorded. However, the use of that is to see the student's work process, so that we can gain this richer process data about the student's work rather than just seeing the dollar figure at the end of the costing exercise. So yeah, there certainly are some good learning moments. I'd view that more as kind of evidencing what the student can do than trying to surveil them to not do the wrong thing.
Michael, do you think we still have time for one more question?
We've got 2 precious minutes, so let's get another question in, if that's all right with you, Yusong.
Absolutely. There's a question by Craig asking about the integration of academia and workplaces. So Craig asks or says that the world of the workplace is rife with practices that do not meet standards of academic integrity. So how do we align these two standards and make sense of the gap when we try to integrate what we are doing in academia with what is happening in the workforce?
We may want to change our standards in academia for some of it. We don't necessarily have the perfect standards that are universal that work everywhere. You know, Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, was ghost written. Maybe we might want to start allowing that. I don't know, but I think we also want to be wary of problems in academia. You know, say there's evidence that medical students who have academic integrity problems have more professional integrity problems. We want to build those capabilities in people and the ethics and the integrity. Yeah, I think it's complex, but I am open to some flexibility there if we need to change our standards.
Can I make a point about this? And it's not about the academic integrity specifically, but about the gaps between university practice and workplace practices, and how standards that we might seek to achieve within university are perhaps worked around and tinkered with and changed in workplaces for good reason sometimes, because of the situated nature and the different context. And I think two things perhaps we can do is firstly help students develop their evaluative judgment about what good looks like for this particular situation, in the sense that You know, there's rationales for shifting a standard in a workplace that is meaningful and appropriate, and other times it ruptures, and knowing where that rupture might happen is something that is, you know, we can help to do through evaluative judgment. The second thing I would say is to get curious with students about these gaps and why they are there, and to have that conversation around, you know, what does this practice, why is this practice, for example, different in the workplace, and to problematize that a little bit. And so, for example, in medicine, again, professionalism, you know, this is we talk a lot about, oh, people out there aren't very professional, but actually, you know, the standards are different, and what we need to do is to help students come back in after being in the workplace to talk about these dilemmas and the differences, and be critical about them, not just that it's wrong out there or it's right here, but it's just different, and let's talk about that. So yeah, that would be what I would say. We're getting the wind up. Can I just answer your question, Michael? I think we need to be optimistic and act. This is the time, and if we don't do that now in terms of the big visions to change assessment, when is the right time? And I don't want to accept administrative computer says no, this can't, for, you know, as a good enough reason to not make these necessary changes. That's my 2 cents worth.
And that's fantastic. I think you've wrapped up for me, Rola. That's a wonderful way to finish. Look, we have finished this precious time. So I want to thank everybody who has attended. And of course, there will be a recording of this for those who couldn't make it right now. But personally, and on behalf of everyone who's been watching, thank you to Margaret, Rola and Phil, and to Yuso for managing the questions. And a final plug on behalf of the presenters is that there is a wonderful book launch at 6 o'clock tonight. So if you can, come along and we'll see you there. Thanks, everyone.